Hello, awesome people. My name is Mary. I am your friendly teen services librarian at the Scotlandville Branch Library, and this month we are going to be resist dying. First things first, the usual heads up. Supplies are very limited for this. First come, first serve. So, what is resist dyeing? Now, resist dyeing is a process where you dye fabric, and then when you're finished dyeing the fabric, it has patterns in it. This pattern is formed by various techniques that will prevent the dye from soaking into those particular areas of the fabric, hence why it's called resist dyeing. You want the dye to resist soaking into certain parts of the fabric, so you have that contrast. A number of different cultures around the world have practiced resist dyeing throughout history. Japan, Indonesia, and West African countries like Nigeria, Ghana, Sierra Leone, and Ivory Coast have all made textiles using resist dyeing. So there are a number of methods you can use to make resist dyed fabric. The first one is probably the one most of us are familiar with, where you tie the fabric up in different places using string or rubber bands, and then you dye the fabric. This is what we would call tying and dyeing, or tie-dye. The next one is where you take a needle and thread and you sew the specific places together that you don't want the fabric to soak up the dye. And the last is where you use some kind of medium like paste or wax, or in our case glue, and you put it onto the fabric and you let it dry, and that glue or that paste or that wax soaks in and prevents the dye from soaking in. So here are some types of resist dyeing. On the left we have what most people usually think of when you think of resist dyeing, Indonesian batik fabric. And batik is made by putting melted wax onto fabric. You paint it on, you let that wax set, and then you dye it, and then you scrape the wax off, and it makes this really nice resist effect. The second is a Japanese technique called shibori. That's where you either tie it up or you sew it up, and those places where you tied or sewed the fabric resist the dye. And the last example on the right is Nigerian adire fabric, which is either tied and dyed or painted with a paste made of cassava, which is a type of root vegetable, or maize, which is corn. To learn more about resist dyeing, go ahead and check out these books that we have here at the East Baton Rouge Parish Library. So let's get started. In your bag, you will get a bandana, some washable gel glue, some black fabric dye, and the salt has already been added to this dye. You'll get a spoon, and you'll get a couple of rubber gloves. You will also need a plastic container. It needs to be big enough to hold at least 2 quarts of water, and it also needs to be something that you don't mind possibly getting stained. You will also need water, at least 2 quarts worth. And then these things are optional, but if you don't want to use your hands to stir, you'll need something else to stir with, like a big plastic spoon. You'll also need something to cover your table with, and then a pencil. But those last three things are, as I said, optional. Okay, so first things first is you need to draw with your glue. You need to lay your bandana out flat and then draw whatever you want on it with the glue. I personally recommend sticking to patterns, so things like zigzags, stripes, polka dots, swirls, geometric shapes, things like that. If you're feeling brave, you can try drawing, text, words, or you could try drawing pictures, but they may not transfer well. I tried it with mine, and if you fast forward to the end, you'll see it didn't transfer as well as I hoped it would. Now, this is an optional step. If you have a pencil, you can draw these patterns ahead of time very lightly with your pencil, or you can just freehand it. Once you've drawn what you want, let the glue dry completely before you move on to the next step, and I mean completely. Mine was dry in about 18 hours, but you may want to leave yours even longer. I've seen some people leave theirs for 24, even 36 or 48 hours before they even mess with theirs again. Now, a word of warning, the glue will soak through the bandana to the table underneath. You want this to happen because if it soaks through, that means it will resist the dye a little bit better. So you want to put something underneath your bandana if you're worried about the glue sticking to your table and damaging it. What you use is up to you. You could use a plastic tablecloth or wax paper, a garbage bag, a couple of grocery bags laid out flat, a plastic shower curtain if you have one. I wouldn't use newspaper or paper towels because they will stick to the paper rather than, peeling off. And because of how easily it tears, it would just be a mess. So here is my attempt at drawing some things on with glue. It's kind of hard to see, but I did a zigzag at the bottom, and then I put the words "Be Happy" right above it. Alright, once you're sure your glue is completely dry, you will want to go ahead and make your dye bath. You'll want to fill your plastic container with room temperature or slightly warm water. I didn't really measure how much water I put in for my dye bath, but I'm guessing it was probably about 2 to 3 quarts. I'm using a 12-quart bin that I got from the dollar store. But you just want to make sure you use enough that you can completely submerge your bandana without water flowing over the sides, because if your dye flows over the side, you're going to have a great big mess. Now, if you're familiar with dyeing fabric with powdered dye, you know you have to get that water extremely hot. But you don't want to get your water extremely hot for this. If you do get your water extremely hot and you dunk your fabric into it, the glue will melt off and you won't get any resist patterns. So that's why I recommend keeping your water kind of room temperature or even just slightly warm, but don't go super duper steaming hot. Once you've got your water in the container, you'll go ahead and open up that Ziploc bag and pour the contents of the Ziploc bag into the water and stir it around until all of the dye and all of the salt is completely dissolved. What I did is I put on one of my gloves and I stirred it around with my hand until it was completely dissolved. But if you don't want to do that, you can use the spoon that's provided, or you can use a bigger spoon if you want to, whatever. Then dye your bandana. Put your bandana into that dye bath, stir it around constantly for about 15 minutes, and then leave it alone and stir it every once in a while for about the next 45 minutes or so. What I did after I finished that 15 minutes of constant stirring is I left it alone and then I stirred it 2 more times, each about 20-ish minutes apart. Once you've let your bandana sit in the dye for about 45 more minutes and stirred it every once in a while, take the bandana out of your dye bath and pour the dye down the drain. Just be sure if you pour it down the drain that you rinse your sink out really well as soon as you do that, because this dye can stain. Rinse your bandana under cold water until the water runs clear. So I rinsed it, I squeezed it, I rinsed it, I squeezed it, I rinsed it, I squeezed it until the water came clear when I was squeezing it. When you are rinsing your bandana for the first time, when you've just taken it out of the dye bath, keep your gloves on. This picture was after I had rinsed it out several times, so it wasn't like leaking dye all over the place anymore. But when you take it immediately out of the dye bath and start rinsing it for the first time, keep your gloves on. Once the water comes back clear from rinsing it in cold water, then you'll want to wash it with hot, soapy water to wash the glue off. I just want to take a second to recommend that you hand wash for this step. I don't know if throwing it in the washing machine will gum up your washing machine, so I would just use some, hot water and some soap and just scrub it to get the glue off by hand. Then all that's left is to let your bandana dry. So this particular dye says to let your bandana dry away from direct sunlight and away from heat. So you could either hang it up to dry in a cool place, or if your dryer has a cool setting, you could use that. Okay, so here are some helpful tips that I learned while I was making this. First things first, you really need to go heavy on the glue. The more glue you use, the better chance you have of that part of the bandana resisting the dye. If you rewind and you see the finished product that I made, you'll see that some of the zigzag and some of the letters that I drew didn't really transfer. The H-A-P and happy didn't really come through. So you really need to lay down that glue really thick. Now, another thing I've learned is the bandanas are thin enough that you can print out patterns and lay them underneath your bandana. You can trace them that way instead of drawing them on in pencil. But that's just a matter of preference. If you don't mind washing off the pencil marks, you can just use the pencil, either way. And one last thing is, if you're worried about spilling and like getting black fabric dye on like your carpet or something, you can do this outside, but don't pour the dye in the grass when you're done. This dye has salt in it, and salt and grass really don't mix very well. If you pour the salty dye out into the grass, it'll kill your grass. Alright, so that's it. I hope you enjoy making this if you pick this up at the Scotlandville Library or if you decide to make this at home. Thanks for watching, and remember, stay awesome!